rail, freight, logistics, as well as ports, cruise liners, car rentals, full multimodal solutions. So thank you for joining us today, Lee. He's had leadership roles in both Amtrak as well as United Airlines, so really interesting concepts around multimodal. So thank you, Dee. And I shall be joining this discussion as well, so I shall sit down.
Hopefully you can hear me. Well, first of all, let me just say that we're pleased to be here today. Thank you for IRS and having the Rail Summit. We're glad to be here in person. After such a moving panel that we just had, our hearts go out, of course, to the people, and I love the way that we're focused on the actual people, both of the railways as well as the Ukrainian people, to help us where we can. So hopefully that'll be something that we can keep in our hearts as we continue the theme of people. So today we've got a wonderful panel. We're going to start with two presentations. Hopefully we have the webcast working. So let me just introduce who we have today. We have Silvia Roldán, who's the CEO of Madrid Metro. She'll be providing an opening presentation for us here shortly. And then we'll move to Dzikus, who is the Chief Urban Basic Services Section at the UN Habitat. Tell you what, let's go ahead and start with the presentation there, and then we'll fully introduce the panel as we get into the discussion. And knowing we have a hard stop today, as we have a next panel, we'll go ahead and just jump right into the topic. So hopefully, Silvia, you are ready to present the first topic. Silvia, are you there? Okay, great.
I'm Silvia Roldán, CEO of Metro de Madrid. For me, it's an enormous pleasure to be here with you, serving this amazing roundtable. So sorry, for me, it's a pity. I wanted to be there, but it was impossible. Well, I hope that we can join this presentation, and thank you again for inviting me to participate. Public transport is a basic need and one of the main indicators of quality of life in cities. This is not a small thing. 55% of the world's population live in cities. By 2050, cities will be the home of 68% of the world's population. Public transport is a prerequisite for UN Sustainable Development Goal 11. Make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Only an efficient public transport network can cope with this challenge. be helpful for many people who will take advantage of reliable mass transport system. Public transport is a champion of sustainable mobility. This is a sentence we say time and again, and the result sounding cliche. Reducing fossil energy consumption on sustainable ground is a great reason to use public transport. In Madrid, using metro means pollution 3.4 times less than using private transport. We avoid the use of 89 million cars and motorbikes. Public transport is a reliable ally in the fight against the terrible challenge posed by climate change. This is one of the best assets the public transport community has to stress our essential contribution against pollution and climate change, especially among potential users. It's a serious challenge, but there is room for action. The best engineering can help the world providing public transport solution and opening new perspectives. New figures from Metro de Madrid will help understand what research and innovation can do to meet the energy challenge and to support sustainability. By implementing our plan of energy efficiency, we can cut by 25% the energy for daily operation. We have also cut by 26% our greenhouse emission and our carbon footprint by 21%. I will not speak on terms of real politics, but the harsh reality has elbowed its way to the headlines. The public transport is perhaps the best answer to the energy crisis. But the first time since the 1970s, the looming energy crisis threatens public and private welfare. Taking up public transport is a question of national interest because we offer a way of rationalizing energy costs, providing good transport at reasonable prices for most people. And as I told you before, the electricity supply to Metro de Madrid comes entirely from renewable sources. Public transport companies should take a firm stand of other challenge. I like to underline inclusion. We have worked very hard to ensure that all stations are required to impute accessibility requirements. Now, 78% of our whole network is fully accessible. By 2028, 84% of our stations will be fully accessible. However, the concept of accessibility is not limited to offering this means to ensure a safe and comfortable trip for everyone. We need to take care of people with several disabilities, and that means implementing many different improvements, such as special signage, double handrails, or adapted ticket machines. Being inclusive goes much further. It means offering a fair deal to everyone, no matter their condition. In my opinion, the best way to promote the social value of public transport is offering an effective service for everyone. Public transport fosters economic development and enhances quality of life, and it is the best possible contribution towards sustainable, resilient, and smart cities. No future is possible without the invaluable contribution of public transport. Let's work to improve its strengths and potentialities. So thank you very much. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation.
Well, thank you, Silvia, for your comments. And clearly, accessibility for all is a cornerstone of the discussion today, right? It is about people. It is about making sure the inclusion and the accessibility is there. So let's go ahead and move on. We also have Andre, who should be on our web call as well. Hopefully he's ready. And let's turn to him. He's the Chief, again, Urban Basic Services for UN Habitat.
Hi, Andre here. I hope you can hear me. I'm trying to see how to share my screen.
We can hear you just fine. Go ahead.
sharing with you a short presentation on urbanization and the social value of mobility. And the unique thing I'll be presenting is actually from an African perspective, because that's where the world headquarters of the United Nations for Human Settlements is located. And as we've heard from our previous speaker, that 68% of the population by the year 2050 will be living in cities. But something very unique about this is that 90% of the urban population increase between now and 2050 will actually happen in Africa and in Asia. That means around 1 billion people will be joining us in cities. And if we would be catapulting ourselves to the year 2050, the cities we'll be seeing at that time have actually not been built. So this is actually a very unique opportunity for us. As we know that this growth is going to happen, we can actually plan for those cities ahead of them actually emerging and coming up, and putting in sustainable urban mobility solutions into these cities. In sub-Saharan Africa, of course, what we're also seeing is that with the very rapid urbanization, we see that 61% of many of the dwellers in cities in sub-Saharan Africa ending up in slums and squatter settlements. These cities are very often on the fringes, or these settlements are very often on the fringes of cities. The other thing which we're seeing is actually that many of the cities, as they grow, are either growing horizontally or vertically. And we can see here the examples from Lagos and Kinshasa over the last couple of years, showing that they're all growing horizontally. And if we look at middle income or lower middle income countries like Bangladesh or Vietnam, Dhaka, or Ho Chi Minh City, we still see a very strong horizontal growth with very limited vertical growth. And if we look at economies like China and South Korea, we see that cities are moving vertically. And this, of course, has a very important impact in terms of mobility solutions. And on the right-hand side, we see a picture of Lagos, which is a mega city with more than 10 million inhabitants. And you can see how from 1990 to 2015, this city has expanded in actually area space considerably, nearly tripling or quadrupling its space it's occupying. And of course, what is happening with this urban growth is a typical scene that we are moving more and more into a car-based system with transit corridors, and we very often see poor integration of mobility systems in the cities. And of course, the other issue which we're seeing is that the urban poor are really living on the outskirts of these very rapidly growing cities because they can't afford the housing in the city centers or in the areas of the cities. And of course, the SDG 11.2, we've heard about it, and UN Habitat is the custodian of this SDG, which is really measuring access to public transport. And if we look at it globally, the latest statistics, urban indicator statistics, show us that the world, that 51.6% of people in average in the world have got access to public transport. But we've got a great differentiation in this. If we look at North America and Europe, nearly 90% of the population, or in Australia and New Zealand, 85% of the population have got access to public transport. But if on the other hand, we look at Central and South Asia, we look at Sub-Saharan Africa, we see that only 30% of the population have got access to public transport. So these are challenges we have to look at and to see how we can overcome them and ensure that more and more people, especially in those areas which are going to be experiencing the most rapid urban growth in the next 20, 30 years, can gain access to public transport. I'd also like to reflect a little bit on equity and transportation, and I'd like to give you an example from the city where we're based, and that is Nairobi. We're about 4 to 5 million inhabitants. And if you look at it, in Nairobi, 85% of the residents do not own a car, but the cities are planned for roads and cars, and there's a lot of congestion. And many of the people actually rely on walking in their daily lives. Nearly 36% of the people actually walk to their place of work. And another 45% use informal transport systems, and only 4% use cycling, and 18% use cars to get to where they have to go. But this is a picture of the sidewalk in Nairobi. And with keeping in mind that the majority of the people investment, for instance, into safe walking spaces needs to be increased and, of course, made much easier and faster for people to move. Another element to look at is that fatalities amongst users. And we can see that nearly up to 70% of all accident fatalities are actually attributed to pedestrians. So we really have to make sure how we can increase the safety and security for pedestrians in our cities who are coming from train stations to move into the rest of the city. Another social element to look into is how much the poor actually spend for transportation. And in Nairobi, it's that many of the poor spend 30% of their income on transport. And this has got to do with the fact that most of the low-income settlements are on the periphery of the city. And as the cities expand, people have to move further and further away to get to their place of work or to other amenities. A fourth social dimension, which is extremely important, is actually safety amongst public transport systems, and of course, the inaccessibility for people, particularly differently abled or disabled people, to the public transport system. And 43% of Nairobi's women do not travel or do tasks outside of the house after dark due to security reasons. And this is one of the statistics which our colleagues have collected from our mobility team. Another part is to see how long does it take to get to a place of work in Nairobi. And we can see by foot, you can see the green area on the left-hand side. That is within 30 minutes commute time to get to a place of work. All the other places are out of reach. If you think about informal mini transport, it's a little bit better. But if you own a car, most of the places of work are actually within 30-minute commuting time. So keeping in mind that very few people actually own a car, this is just a call for need for investments into more public transport solutions. But why do people actually move? It's not just to access their jobs. We can actually see that 24% of the trips in Nairobi are for shopping, 17% for personal business, 17% for recreation, 14.3% for work, 9% for accessing services, for instance, hospital and medical services, and 6% for visiting friends. Just some final reflections in this area is linking urban growth with land use policy and transportation investments is extremely important. We have to really rearrange the institutional arrangements in cities so that there's a stronger collaboration between the transport and urban planning authorities. There's a need for stronger investments into public transport, non-motorized transport, but also increased investments into light rail systems and metro systems. Many of the cities in sub-Saharan Africa don't have light rail or metro systems. Many cities have moved into bus rapid transit systems. And of course, non-motorized transport as the last mile solutions coming from the mobility hubs are very important. And of course, the inclusion of communities into the decision-making as to how we plan the sustainable mobility solutions for our cities. So with this, ladies and gentlemen, I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Andre, for wonderful, challenging, yet wonderful aspect. I think each of us, as we look for rail solutions, and not just that, but mobility solutions, we can understand the greater good that transport systems can have. So let me go ahead and introduce a little bit more. I know some of them are, I think all of them have been introduced already, but let me just quickly go through. We'll introduce, and then what we'll do is we'll just ask them some questions. I'd also like to invite the audience, if you have some questions, we will probably have some time to be able to have you ask as well. A broad topic for us today on social mobility and the purpose there. But let me go ahead and introduce to my left, Tran, Head of Sustainable Mobility for ICLEI. And we'll turn to her first here momentarily. And then we have Jodi Evans, who is the Women Transport Workers and Gender Equality Officer for the International Transport Workers Federation. And then, of course, one of our co-chairs, we have Lucie Anderton, Head of Sustainable Development for UIC. So again, our topic today is all about the social purpose of mobility, the greater good that it can have on our environment. So let me turn to me. From your perspective, I know we had some earlier discussions. How do you see social mobility being impactful, not just to, of course, Africa and other countries that you've seen, but how do more European countries, and even those that are attending here, more of other countries be able to leverage this and use that in their own planning as well?
Thank you very much for this question. I think mobility for cities, it's more of a comprehensive perspective, and especially in ICLEI, we promote sustainable development, and so we take the systemic approach. And in particular, we promote 5 different pathways on circularity, low emission development, people-centered, and many more. And mobility is one of these cross-cutting issues. And in particular, the vision of cities is really to build a healthy and climate-friendly cities. And so mobility, the social part of mobility is very important to be able to address and include all levels of population. And we hear a lot about gender, about vulnerability, but then we have to also consider the elder population, the young population, and also the unemployed and the other type of vulnerable population, although the term is not that great. And I think that perhaps one point, because a lot has already been covered by the other colleagues, is really about how the pandemic, for instance, has really, at least for cities, has shown what was impossible, like promoting walking and cycling, and now now we have an opportunity to really redistribute the space in the cities. And but then there is much more to be done, in the sense that there has been a pandemic for a long time. Then there is the climate crisis. There have been also in Europe, of course, Ukraine. And then sustainability cannot be put on the side just to, but it needs to be a long-term vision with also the right type of financing. But one particular example that I want to give to also communicate the social value, and not only thinking about the stakeholders, is really this part of the city of Vienna, where they are saying that for each 1 million of investment in the rail system equals to 1.1 million of euros, and 11 jobs during the construction, and much more afterwards. And so I think that this type of communication is also very important, to be able to capture the value of this, the social value of public transport.
Now, wonderful, and I think we've all seen that investment is critical for providing accessibility, expanding rail, and so forth. But I think I'm going to ask Jodi to talk about some of the gender-based issues as well. And I know we've had some good discussions about what are some concrete actions that people today in rail, without large dollars, can do to have an impact on some of the gender issues that I know exist today.
Thanks, Dee. I think that the social purpose of mobility recognises its important role in providing access to jobs, but emphasis tends to be on transport services and users of the service, with little focus on transport work itself. Transport provides access to jobs globally, including those it creates. So social purpose must be grounded in decent and dignified work for women and for men, including safe and decent jobs, formal and secure jobs. We were hearing about Nairobi earlier, where the entire transport system, public transport system, is informal. Jobs with labour rights and collective bargaining. But the reality is very different. Violence is endemic, and it is considered part of the job. Gender myths and stereotypes, which should be consigned to history, they still thrive. Simple things like uniform and PPE that's designed for men and isn't safe for women's bodies. And some things that I think are easy to overlook when we work in offices, the lack of basic rights like access to a toilet, among many other issues, systemically exclude women from some of the best jobs in the industry and leave them concentrated in some of the worst, which impacts women's health, their safety, and their dignity. So with these and other gendered impacts, women are also too often invisible in the data collection and analysis, which I think is another inexpensive but really necessary missing piece of the work that's needed to be done. And as our industry transitions to sustainable mobility, the future of work for women in transport will become even more pressing. Because if these problems persist, can we say that mobility is truly fitting our vision of its social purpose? So improving gender equality is critical to sustaining sustainability and the resilience of the sector, and is of benefit to women and to men. To build safe, accessible and equitable transport systems, gender equality needs to be integrated throughout the mobility agenda, including through shaping the transport vision and policy to progress gender equality, understanding and influencing new developments in transport and their impacts for women, promoting women's employment, decent work and labour rights, shaping mobility-related infrastructure and representation of women in decision-making about transport and mobility. So just lastly, the ITF has launched a global safe and sustainable rail campaign, which promotes rail as a key part of public transport and includes demands for investment, expansion and accessibility. Railway workers are vital to ensuring that everyone can access their right to mobility. Staff in stations, on platforms and onboard trains are really critical for that purpose. So the campaign includes a demand to expand job opportunities for women and end their systemic exclusion from some of the best jobs in rail, as well as promoting violence and harassment-free railways, which can really be a serious barrier for women travelling and working in rail. So the last point I want to make is that workers must not be left behind. Investment in rail often includes new technology and automation, which particularly impacts women workers who are concentrated in customer service roles that are being replaced by machines. So if the future of mobility is to be socially just, then labour and gender impact assessments must be carried out and the workers must be part of that vision.
Now, wonderful topic, and clearly there are things we can do. And I love the way, if you remember on our call, we talked about safety and dignity. And how do we bring safety and dignity to all, not just passengers, but workers, particularly in the gendered response you're just talking about. So wonderful, thank you. Lucie, coming to you, wearing your UIC hat under the sustainability umbrella. As we know, 11.2 talks about, I have the words here, it says, with special attention to the needs of those in vulnerable situations, women, children, persons with disabilities, and older persons. What do you think some concrete actions could be for people in this room and people listening about how they can elevate the purpose of mobility and extend sustainability?
Yeah, so great question, because I have the pleasure actually of working and talking to people who run railways from all around the world, of course, and I've heard some really exciting, simple, practical things that people are doing, and that's my pleasure, is being able to share these kind of things. We run this group called Inclusive Stations, actually, which is just people that run stations all around the world and are trying to do something different, so go beyond just being a place where people get on and off of trains. And I think that's sort of, the kind of thing we're talking about here is we don't just run trains, we don't just sell tickets, that's not just why we're here to run railways. And stations can be so much more than that. And so for example, in Polish railways, they've got several stations were unmanned or underused or very infrequently used. So they went around talking to the community that station served and asked, what do you want from this station? How can it better serve your community? How can we transform its purpose and its use? And so rethink about how these spaces can be used to serve the community. So there were pop-up shops, there were wedding venues, there were libraries, there were schools, there were creches, there were all sorts of transforming the way these spaces that are there, often underused. So some really exciting work there. And in that same session, we were sharing about how we better work and engage with street homeless, that particularly our big destination stations have got a growing community of street community that our station staff engage with on a daily basis, and how we can better engage and manage that issue, because historically often our station staff were literally moving them around and going from one door to another. It really doesn't help anybody. But what I've heard from several of our members now is a real change in the mindset of how do we work together with the cities, with the transport police, and but also with social actors, with social workers and charities and NGOs to do something totally different. And they've been coming together and coordinating it, and with a real safeguarding, responsible approach, investing in the way that they work with vulnerable people, not just passengers, but others that they interact with every day. So there's some really exciting ways that we can just do some simple ways just to serve our communities and be part of the cities that we're so important that we're part of, you know.
No, it's a wonderful point. I think one of the points I just heard was we're not here to just run the railways. There is a larger purpose. I hope that everybody listening is feeling a theme, that there is a broader purpose to the efforts in the international stage. I think the last presentation that we had clearly talked about some of the challenges, but then again, how do we then extend what we have? So I'm gonna, Silvia, are you still online by chance? She's not. Okay, thank you. We'll come back here, but if we kind of go on that theme and say, and let me open it up, we can have whoever would like to respond. Knowing that we're trying to instill a broader purpose for rail, sometimes it's easy for rail providers and companies to just focus on their region or their company, and even coming to events like this and participating in a global initiative such as the sustainability, it's a little bit hard sometimes because the day-to-day challenges, right? I was going to ask Silvia about how she's managing this, but knowing that that's a challenge, how do we get people to understand that vision of trying to have a greater purpose than just running rail? We've talked about multimodal, we've talked about the integrated mobility. What are some things you think that we can do to inspire people to put more effort, more time, more investment in elevating this greater purpose? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I can start.
Please.
So I think that there is a shift in mobility in general in the conversation. It's not only moving from A to B, it's becoming mobility as a service, not the mass, but really the service component of it. It's not only about infrastructure, but it's also about making everything more attractive. So it's a bit the conversation about mobility in terms of frequency and technology and modal transport, and looking into accessibility. So how to make sure that there is a physically accessible and proximity, but also the part of the cognitive side. If there is an app, how do I cater also for elder population? And so make sure that the signs are there and the signs are universally understandable. And then at the same time, like the financial part, like making sure that it's accessible from a monetary perspective and from an emotional perspective also to make sure that it's safe and secure. I think that the fragmentation, it's a bit the challenge that we're facing also at the local government level because of the difficult governance, and even within the municipalities, essentially sometimes active mobility is with the environment with the Department of Environment, public transport is with the transport, and so on and so forth. And sometimes there is a lot of unclarity as well, which level, local, regional, or national level. And therefore, I think it's very important to have a good coordination mechanism across all the different partners, in the sense that the private sector is making their part in creating coordination mechanism. National government should really drive the conversation along with the subnational government. Perhaps I went a bit broad,
No.
but that is my perspective on that.
Any other thoughts? Please.
Yeah, it's interesting, we were talking last night a little bit about how you make the business case for rail, in fact, investing in rail or investing in public transport, and how people love numbers, and how you need to make the business case, and you need to make the ratio work and things like that. And we were talking about, but that misses, you know, if we're only counting ticket sales, for example, it misses a huge amount of value. And actually there's a developing school of thought around how we can put valuation on the social benefits of something like public transport, and I think that's the sort of the academic school of thought and the thinking that we need to embed into the way we develop projects and how we make a case for investment, where you can monetize and value the benefit of every time a single person is able to access a job they weren't able to access before. It has a benefit to society that can be monetized, and so we need to start embedding sort of more numbers and more value into the way that we make decisions in the railway, and so it will change the way that we invest and see value. That's how
Sure.
we see it.
Well, Jodi, on that, I know we've talked about the gender response to some of these pieces, but how do we get people to really, from the day-to-day actions, right, really own this purpose of it's greater than rail? We are here to provide accessibility to people that may not have that. I don't know, any thoughts from the gender response side?
Thanks, Dee. I think the lens that we apply to need and solutions is really important, because the numbers are really important, but the numbers look very different if you apply them to different groups of users and workers. And so thinking about the data we collect, I can't say enough about gaps in data, particularly where women and other marginalised groups of our society, as far as that goes. But who we involve in the discussions, who's at the table, who's considered a stakeholder. I think looking at the reasons why people travel or why people work in rail, and the reasons that they don't travel and that they don't either take a job in rail or maintain a job in rail. I think the retention of women in the industry is something that really needs attention. So I have to come back to the resource that we have in transport workers, who are vital to everybody accessing their rights to mobility, but also are very connected with the people that are using the services. So I think that moving away from looking at the numbers in the big picture and looking at that through specific lenses is really significant opportunity.
No, thank you. Let me go ahead. We have about 5 or 6 minutes. Let me open it up to the audience. Hopefully you found this an engaging discussion. Any questions that anybody may have specifically on the purpose, the larger purpose we've just talked about, or the social value of mobility? Okay, we'll tell you what, if you have your, please, yes.
Andre, yes, I have a question for Andre Dzikus. And what we have seen is that all provisions say that the largest part of population will live in town in 2050, maybe 80%. But is this resilient for humanity? I think it's not. We have seen also in the COVID situation, the spread of this kind of disease in larger city is very critical. Is it possible that transportation could increase the distribution of population, secondary city, etc.? Could be this a mean to modify this paradigm? Thank you.
So do we have Andre online, and did he hear that question? Do we know if we have Andre online? Okay, it does not look like we have Andre online, so let me open it up to the panel. Is there any thoughts about the resiliency, the creation of, I'm trying to make sure your question's clear, around how rail and other forms of modality can impact other cities to make sure it's a resilient approach, particularly I'm presuming like Africa, where we have a very low percentage of mobility solutions accessible from them. Any thoughts?
I can go.
Please, please.
So there is a bit of a difference between Europe or North America and the Global South. There is, especially in the cities, mega cities, the density is of a total different scale. What is challenging is really the sprawl, like the urban sprawl, and in particular in Africa, the issue is really the segregation and the legacy of zoning, essentially, or in certain regions is also the historical legacy of separating different races. And the lack of infrastructure. I mean, we've seen it, and they mentioned, Yona Patatas mentioned it, there are no road infrastructure, the connectivity with the rural area is even bigger, and then the issue is really that most of the time the population is concentrated in the bigger cities because, as we heard, mobility is about jobs, accessing to jobs and services. That's why it's to get to the core of your question, that's why the mass transit investment is such a key component from my perspective, and also the idea of, which is taking up the idea of the transit-oriented development at that point. And making sure that you don't only build the mass transit, but that is accessible. And then the integration with informal public transport, that's the most important part, because on one hand, it's creating a bit of chaos, safety issues, but on the other hand, they are serving really the population, and in certain regions, it's about the majority, really, 70%, 80% of the population and how they move across the different regions. About the secondary cities, instead, it really depends country to country, so it's a bit hard to answer in a general question. But secondary cities have the issue really about then how do you retain the population there and how do you attract the population?
Yeah, it seems as I run our global travel and transportation side, I mean, one of the things we've talked about is this, how do we drive people with passion that's beyond rail, right? How do we get groups like UIC to have this larger vision that's beyond just rail, it's more for mobility and about extending, but you have great gaps between Africa, we were introduced by Andres at 36% of accessibility for rail solutions or mobility solutions versus, Europe and the US and other, developed countries at 80, 90%. There's clearly a gap, but I guess it comes down to, and maybe we just quickly go, like last topic here, and maybe we quickly just touch this if you can summarize very quickly. What do you think that we can do as an industry body to bridge that gap? Because the fact is there are people that are disadvantaged. And one of the core topics we talked about, safety, we talked about dignity, but how do we extend mobility? We know the value is there, but how do we bridge that gap between those that have and those that don't? Let's just quickly go down the line and we'll finish up with this. So I don't know if Lucie, if you can start, and then we'll go to Jodi, and then we'll go to here as well. To me.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think what we do at UIC is to try and advocate for rail, really, an investment in public transport and build that case for it. In all parts of the world. And what we can do as an international organisation is help the transfer of knowledge, transfer of technology from different regions, so that there's the learning that have been had in more developed infrastructure can be shared with members that are still on that journey of developing the industry. So that's what we're trying to do, bridge that gap and build capacity where we need to in the members that are still developing.
Wonderful. Thank you. Jodi.
I'd like to hone in on gender-based violence. there was a striking statistic from a study in India pre-pandemic, maybe about 2019, 2018, around women graduates and the proportion of Indian women graduates who were in paid employment. And that number had plummeted. And the number one reason that they gave for not being in paid employment was lack of safe access to public transport. There are all sorts of cultural issues, but also industry issues, and planning and staffing, I think, are major factors. If already we have women, I think the statistic was there from Nairobi around women who are not leaving the home or moving around in the city, or certainly in urban areas as well, in rural areas after darkness. If we remove staff from train stations, if we remove guards from trains, is that improving women's access to rail, or is it indeed sending it in the other direction? So gender-based violence for me is a priority issue.
Great point. Tumi, last words.
So just 2 words, I think partnership and vision, or two. Having a good vision and working together with the different partners and together, because we are running out of time, essentially.
Well, and every minute counts.
Exactly.
Right. Let me ask for a warm applause for our wonderful panel here and for those that presented as well. Hopefully you enjoyed and were engaged in this topic. It's a very important one. So let me say thanks to each of our panelists as well. Thanks again.